The story of Achilles begins not with his birth, but with a wedding. On the slopes of Mount Pelion in Thessaly, where the centaur Chiron kept his cave, the gods of Olympus gathered to celebrate the marriage of the sea goddess Thetis to a mortal king named Peleus. It was an unusual union, immortal and mortal, divine and human, and it had not come about by choice. Thetis was one of the 50 Nereids, daughters of the ancient sea god Nereus, and she was among the most beautiful beings in existence. Zeus had wanted her. Poseidon had wanted her. Both had pursued her with the persistence that divine desire tends to produce. Both had stopped when they heard what the fates had declared. Thetis would bear a son who surpassed his father. If Zeus married her, the son would surpass Zeus. The king of the Olympians weighed that prospect for as long as it took to decide that the preservation of his throne mattered more than any desire, however powerful, and he arranged for Thetis to marry a mortal instead. A mortal's son who surpassed his father was not a threat to Olympus. He was simply the finest man who had ever lived. Zeus could tolerate that. The alternative was not something he was willing to risk. And so Peleus, king of Phthia and a hero of some distinction, he had sailed with Jason, fought alongside Heracles, participated in the Caledonian boar hunt, found himself the husband of a goddess, invited to a wedding on Mount Pelion that the gods themselves attended as guests. Every god was invited. Every goddess. Every divine being of significance in the Greek world received an invitation, with one exception. Eris, the goddess of discord and strife, was not invited. The reasoning was straightforward. No celebration benefited from her presence, and the gods who arranged the occasion believed, as people tend to believe when they make this kind of decision, that the excluded party would simply stay away. Eris appeared. She came not with violence, but with a single object, a golden apple, small enough to fit in a palm, inscribed with 3 words, "To the most beautiful." She placed it on the table among the wedding gifts and walked away, and the damage was done before anyone understood what had happened. 3 goddesses reached for the apple at the same moment. Hera, queen of the gods. Athena, goddess of wisdom and war. Aphrodite, goddess of love and beauty. Each believed the inscription referred to her. Each refused to yield. Zeus, asked to judge between them, declined without hesitation. No matter which goddess he chose, 2 would be furious with him. And the fury of goddesses was not something the king of Olympus wished to accumulate. He delegated the judgment to a mortal. The mortal he chose was a young man named Paris, a prince of Troy, living on the slopes of Mount Ida as a shepherd, unknown to most of the world, unaware that his own city believed him dead. He had been sent to the mountain as an infant because his mother, Hecuba, had dreamed that she delivered a flaming torch that burned Troy to the ground. The priests who interpreted the dream told her the child would destroy the city. He was given to a servant to be killed on the mountain. The servant could not do it. A shepherd found the infant and raised him instead. He was tending his flock when Hermes arrived with 3 goddesses and an impossible assignment. Each goddess offered Paris a bribe. Hera offered sovereignty, dominion over kingdoms, power over men, the kind of authority that most mortals spent their lives pursuing without ever approaching. Athena offered wisdom and military skill, the ability to win every battle, to outthink every opponent, to be the finest strategist who ever lived. Aphrodite offered him the most beautiful woman in the world. Paris was young. He chose Aphrodite. The most beautiful woman in the world was Helen, queen of Sparta, wife of Menelaus, daughter of Zeus himself. She was not available. Her marriage had been preceded by a competition among nearly every significant king and hero in Greece, each of whom had wanted her. Before the winner was announced, one of the suitors made a proposal. Odysseus of Ithaca, who understood that Helen's beauty was likely to produce war eventually, suggested that every man who had wanted her swear an oath to defend whoever she chose as husband. The oath was designed to prevent the very war it would eventually cause. All the suitors swore. Helen chose Menelaus. The others went home. For a time, the arrangement held. Paris sailed to Sparta. Menelaus, as hospitality required, received him as a guest, housed him, fed him, and treated him with the courtesy owed to a foreign prince. Then Menelaus sailed to Crete for a funeral and left his wife in the palace with their guest. When Menelaus returned, Helen was gone. Paris had taken her, whether by force, persuasion, or some combination, the ancient sources never fully agreed on, and sailed back to Troy with her and with a significant portion of the Spartan treasury. Menelaus went to his brother Agamemnon, king of Mycenae, and the most powerful ruler in the Greek world, and invoked the oath. The Greek world mobilized. Ships were built and requisitioned. Armies assembled at Aulis on the eastern coast of Greece. Heroes who had sworn to defend Menelaus's marriage honored their oaths with varying degrees of willingness. Some came immediately. Some required persuasion. One did not come at all because his mother had already taken him somewhere she believed no one would find him. The child born of the wedding on Mount Pelion had grown into a young man by then, and his mother had spent his entire childhood trying to undo what the fates had decided before he existed. Thetis knew the prophecy. Her son faced a choice with no middle ground. He could live long and quietly in Phthia, grow old among his own people, and die known only to those who had met him personally. Or he could go to Troy, kill the greatest warrior on the Trojan side, and die there himself, young, unmarked by age, remembered by every generation that came after him for as long as any story was told anywhere. The prophecy did not say he would choose. It said the choice would exist. What Thetis understood, watching her son grow under Chiron's instruction on the mountain, was that the choice had already been shaped in the making of him. She had tried to take death from him when he was too young to know what she was doing. She had held him over fire and carried him to the underworld and done everything that divine love and divine power could do to make him proof against the world. It had not been enough. A single point where her grip had held, instead of the water touching, a heel, a tendon, the smallest possible failure of a plan almost perfectly executed. And through that point, the world would eventually enter. The wedding feast on Mount Pelion had put all of this in motion before Achilles drew his first breath, an apple thrown on a table by a goddess who had not been invited. A young shepherd on a hillside asked to make a judgment he could not possibly understand. A woman taken from a palace while her husband was attending a funeral in another country. An oath sworn to prevent a war that the oath itself would cause. Each consequence had followed from the one before it, stretching back to the moment Zeus decided his throne was worth more than his desire and gave a goddess to a mortal king. The greatest warrior who ever lived was the unintended consequence of a god's self-preservation. The son of a marriage arranged to prevent a revolution that never came, already carrying his fate before he was old enough to know what fate meant. He had not yet been asked what he wanted. That conversation was coming. Thetis's first act as a mother was an attempt at an impossible surgery. The accounts divide on how she tried to do it. The older tradition, preserved in fragments and in the Roman poet Statius, describes a ritual she performed on the infant Achilles each night in secret. She held him over fire, not ordinary fire, but the divine flame that burns without consuming, and let it work on his mortal nature while she anointed him with ambrosia during the day. The principle was straightforward: burn away the mortality while preserving everything else. The method required the ritual to run to completion without interference. Peleus interrupted it. He came into the room one night and saw his wife holding their infant son over the flames. The sight required no interpretation from where he stood. He cried out and reached for the child. Thetis released the infant. In some accounts, she departed that same night, returning to the sea in fury at a husband who had broken something she could not repair. The ritual was incomplete. Whatever portion of his mortality the fire had already removed, the point where her grip had held the child above the flames remained as it had always been. The more familiar account places the attempt in the underworld. Thetis carried the infant to the river Styx, the boundary between the living world and the dead, whose waters granted immunity to everything they touched. She dipped her son into the river, holding him by the heel. The water covered everything except the foot she was holding. She brought him back out. He was as close to invulnerable as she could make him, which was not the same thing as invulnerable. Both accounts agree on the outcome. A single point remained mortal, small enough to overlook, easy to forget in the face of everything else he was and everything he would become. The vulnerability would not matter for decades. When it mattered, it would matter completely. After the attempt, Thetis left the young Achilles in the care of the centaur Chiron on the slopes of Mount Pelion. Chiron was unlike every other centaur in the Greek world. The centaurs, horse from the waist down, human above, were generally creatures of appetite and impulse, violent at feasts, dangerous around wine, inclined toward the kind of behavior that produced the legendary brawl at the wedding of the Lapith king Pirithous, where they attempted to carry off the women and were driven out in a battle still commemorated in Greek sculpture centuries later. Chiron shared neither the origin nor the character of the others. His father was not Ixion, the mortal whose union with a cloud phantom produced the centaur race, but Cronus himself, the titan who had ruled before the Olympians. His nature was different in kind from theirs. He was gentle where they were brutal, learned where they were instinctive, measured where they were excessive. He lived in a cave on the mountain, and the list of heroes who had passed through it reads like a summary of Greek mythology's greatest generation. Jason had trained there before leading the Argonauts. Heracles had studied there. Asclepius, who became the god of medicine, had learned his healing craft from Chiron's instruction. Ajax, son of Telamon, had been raised there. Peleus himself had spent time in Chiron's care before he became a king and a husband. The cave was not a school in any formal sense. It was a place where what it meant to be a hero was transmitted from one generation to the next, through demonstration as much as instruction, through the daily example of a teacher who embodied the virtues he taught. What Chiron taught Achilles covered everything a man needed to survive in the world and conduct himself honorably within it. He taught him to play the lyre. This detail survives in the Iliad, confirmed in a scene where Odysseus arrives at Achilles' tent during the embassy and finds him sitting with a lyre across his knees, playing and singing the stories of heroes who had lived before him. The image is one of the most quietly significant in the poem. The finest warrior in the Greek army, on the day the army needs him most urgently, sitting alone with his instrument, finding in it something the war could not provide. Chiron had given him that. He taught him to hunt, to track animals through the forests of Pelion, to read terrain, to move without being heard. He taught him which herbs treated wounds, which treatments reduced fever, which applications drew out infection. Achilles would later teach these things to Patroclus, who would use them on the men who fell at Troy. The knowledge passed from Chiron through Achilles to the man who stood closest to him, a chain of care that ran through the center of the whole story. He taught him honor, not as an abstraction, but as a set of specific obligations that defined what a man owed to his enemies, as well as his allies, to suppliants, to guests, to the gods, and to the dead. The code was demanding and precise, and it would be the measure by which Achilles was judged throughout everything that followed. When rage eventually drove him past the point where the code could hold him, the violation registered as tragedy rather than simple failure, because the code had been so thoroughly his. The young man who emerged from Chiron's instruction on Mount Pelion was everything the mountain had made him. He was the fastest runner of any man alive, faster than horses over short distances, an ability so consistent and so remarked upon that Homer gives him the epithet swift-footed with such frequency that it becomes the primary way the poem thinks of him. He was the most accomplished fighter in his generation. He was also capable of grief, of tenderness, of sitting alone with a lyre and singing to himself in a tent while armies waited outside. It was in Peleus's household, in those years on the mountain, that Patroclus arrived. He came under difficult circumstances. He was the son of Menoetius, a king from Opus in Locris, and he had been a boy when he killed another boy, accidentally, in a quarrel over a game of knucklebones that escalated in the way such things can escalate, without anyone fully intending the outcome. The boy died. Menoetius took his son to Peleus in Phthia to seek shelter, as the custom of supplication required, and Peleus received them. He took Patroclus into the household and raised him alongside Achilles. Patroclus was older. He was steadier, gentler, more patient in his manner. Where Achilles carried his emotions at the surface of everything, his rages immediate, his grief total, his affection expressed without restraint, Patroclus carried his further inside, where they did their work more quietly. He became the person who could reach Achilles when no one else could, the voice that was heard when every other voice had been shut out. From the time of his arrival in the household, the two were inseparable. The sources describe them sharing everything, training together, eating together, sleeping in the same quarters. What the relationship was precisely, the ancient world debated, and the modern world continues to debate. Aeschylus, in a play that no longer survives in full, described them as lovers. Homer's Iliad is deliberately quieter on the subject, conveying the depth of the bond through what happens when it is severed, rather than through any direct statement of its nature. What it was in practice was the central fact of both their lives, the thing around which everything else was arranged, the bond that would determine the emotional shape of the war. By the time the Greek world began mobilizing for Troy, Achilles was the finest warrior alive, and the last person his mother wanted anywhere near a campaign. He was also the one person the campaign could not proceed without. The oracle had been clear. Troy would not fall without Achilles. Those two facts were going to have to meet eventually. Thetis spent as long as she could keeping them apart. Thetis had one option left that did not require fighting what the fates had decided. She took her son to an island. Skyros lay in the northern Aegean, off the coast of Euboea, far enough from the Peloponnese and the gathering of Greek forces that a young man could disappear there without being looked for immediately. Thetis brought Achilles to the court of King Lycomedes, who ruled the island, and asked him to hide her son among his daughters until the war was over or the need for him had passed. Lycomedes agreed. He took the young man into his household, dressed him as a woman, and gave him a name to match the disguise, Pyrrha, meaning the red-haired girl, for the gold-red color of his hair. He placed him among his daughters and hoped the arrangement would hold. It held for longer than might have been expected. The court of Lycomedes was composed entirely of women. His daughters, their attendants, the servants of the household. A young man raised by a centaur in mountain forests was not naturally suited to the domestic rhythms of an island palace. But Achilles adapted to what the situation required. He dressed as the women dressed, moved through the court as they moved, and was known to everyone in the household as Pyrrha. He did not remain entirely a stranger to himself, even there. Among Lycomedes' daughters was a woman named Deidamia, and Achilles fell in love with her. The accounts describe the relationship with varying degrees of detail, but the outcome is not in question. Deidamia became pregnant. She bore a son whose name was Neoptolemus, called Pyrrhus by some after his father's island name. The child was raised on Skyros without his father, who would be gone from the island before the boy was old enough to remember him. Whether Achilles told Deidamia the truth about who he was, whether she knew she was in love with the man the prophecy had already claimed, the sources do not record. What she knew with certainty was that whatever she had with him was not going to last. At Aulis, on the eastern coast of Greece, the assembled Greek fleet sat motionless in the harbor. The winds had stopped. Thousands of soldiers waited on shore, while the ships that were supposed to carry them to Troy stayed where they were, for days and then for weeks. Calchas, the prophet who traveled with the army, gave the reason. Artemis was angry. Agamemnon had killed a deer that was sacred to the goddess, and she had taken the winds as payment. She would return them when Agamemnon gave her the thing she required. What she required was his daughter. Agamemnon sent word to Mycenae. His eldest daughter, Iphigenia, was to come to Aulis immediately, to marry Achilles before the fleet departed. The marriage of a king's daughter to the greatest warrior in the Greek world was not an offer that could be questioned. Clytemnestra brought Iphigenia to Aulis. She arrived expecting a wedding. She found an altar. Achilles had never agreed to any of this. He was still on Skyros. His name had been used, without his knowledge and without his consent, to bring a girl to her death. In some accounts, Iphigenia was killed at the altar, and the winds returned immediately. In others, Artemis relented at the final moment, replacing the girl with a deer and taking Iphigenia away to serve as her priestess in a distant land. What did not vary between the accounts was Clytemnestra's understanding of what her husband had done. The fury she took home from Aulis that day would outlast the war, outlast Agamemnon's return from Troy, and end only when she put a blade in him in the bath of their own palace. The sacrifice of Iphigenia was the beginning of a consequence that would continue long after everyone at Aulis was dead. None of this reached Skyros. Achilles was still Pyrrha. And then the oracle's declaration made its way through the Greek command. Troy cannot fall without Achilles. The finest warrior in the world had to be found. Odysseus was sent to find him. He arrived at Skyros not as a soldier, but as a merchant, which was the form that Odysseus's interventions consistently took. He came with goods spread out for display. Fine cloth, ornaments, decorative objects of the kind that interested a court of women. Hidden among them, beneath the fabric, were weapons: a spear, a sword, a shield. The women of Lycomedes' court gathered around the displayed goods and reached for what appealed to them. Silk and ornaments moved into their hands. The figure called Pyrrha reached for the cloth as the others did. Then a trumpet blast sounded, sharp, sudden, the unmistakable signal of military emergency, the sound that soldiers are conditioned from the beginning of their training to respond to without pausing to think. Odysseus had arranged it. Every woman in the court flinched or stepped back or cried out. Every woman except one. Among the cloth and the ornaments, one figure's hand moved not toward the silk but toward the sword. The grip closed around the hilt. The posture changed entirely. Not the posture of a woman examining goods in a market, but the posture of a soldier who has found a weapon in an emergency and is already assessing the situation around him. Odysseus walked toward him and said nothing that needed to be said aloud. Achilles did not attempt to recover the disguise. He did not negotiate or ask for time. He was found, and he accepted being found with a directness that suggested he had not been trying very hard to remain unfound. Later sources propose that the life on Skyros, however much Thetis had intended it as protection, had been to Achilles a slow erasure of everything Chiron had built in him. He was the finest warrior of his generation, hiding in an island palace while the Greeks assembled for the largest campaign in the history of the world. Whatever the prophecy was going to cost him, an ordinary life in an ordinary place was not a price he was willing to pay. He said his farewells to Deidamia, who had loved him under a false name and borne him a son, and now watched him leave toward a war she understood he would not survive. To the child Neoptolemus, too young to know what the departure meant or what was being taken from him. The farewell to Deidamia is not preserved in any surviving text. What it contained can only be inferred from what she was left with: a son, an island, and the particular grief of loving someone who had already made his decision before you met him. Achilles sailed from Skyros with Patroclus beside him and the Myrmidons at his back. His father's soldiers, the legendary fighters of Phthia, whose discipline and ferocity had made their name a standard for military excellence across the Greek world. He sailed toward Troy, knowing what the prophecy said. He had always known. The choice that Thetis had tried to remove from him before he was old enough to understand it. The choice that the disguise on Skyros was supposed to defer indefinitely had been made at some point earlier than Odysseus's trumpet and quieter than any declaration. It had been made in the interior place where the things a person cannot refuse announce themselves without ceremony. He was going to Troy. He had chosen it the only way anyone chooses anything inevitable, by not choosing otherwise when the chance was there. The Greek fleet beached its ships on the Trojan shore and found almost immediately that the city was not going to fall quickly. The walls were too strong, the garrison too capable, and the Greeks had neither the engineering nor the patience to starve Troy out in a season. What they had was an army that needed feeding, a commander who needed wealth, and the fastest man in the world who needed something to do with himself. The first 9 years of the war were, in large part, Achilles. He raided up and down the Anatolian coast, cities and towns in the Troad and beyond, places that either supplied Troy or simply had the misfortune of being within reach of his speed and his spear. Lyrnessus fell to him, Pedasus fell, Thebes in the Troad fell, a city whose king, Eetion, was the father of Andromache, the woman Hector had married and loved above anything else. Achilles killed Eetion in the sack, which is a detail the Iliad records quietly and without commentary, though it means that the woman closest to Troy's greatest defender had lost her father to the man her husband would eventually face. 23 cities, by some counts, went down to Achilles in those 9 years. The wealth and captives taken from them fed the Greek camp and sustained a war that could not end the direct way. At the sanctuary of Apollo near Tenedos, early in the campaign, Achilles killed a young man named Tenes, a son of the god by some accounts, though his parentage was disputed. He killed him despite his mother's warning that killing any child of Apollo would earn Apollo's permanent enmity. He did it anyway. The god noted it and did not forget. In the Troad as well, near a fountain where a young Trojan prince named Troilus watered his horses, Achilles found him. The oracles had declared Troy could not fall if Troilus reached his 20th year. He was 15 or 16 when Achilles caught him. He reached the sanctuary of Apollo's temple, where divine protection should have shielded him. Achilles followed him inside and killed him at the altar. Apollo, whose sanctuary had been violated, added this to what he was keeping. The debt was accumulating. It would be paid eventually, through an arrow and a heel, on a day still years away. The war was in its 10th year when the conflict within the Greek camp finally crested into the confrontation the Iliad opens with. Chryseis was a daughter of Chryses, a priest of Apollo at the sanctuary of Chrysa on the coast. She had been taken in a raid and awarded to Agamemnon as his share of the plunder. Her father came to the Greek camp carrying gold and the ribbons of his priestly office, the symbols that should have guaranteed him a respectful hearing. Agamemnon refused him. He told the old man the girl would grow old in his household and ordered him to leave. Chryses went down to the shore and prayed to the god he served. Apollo descended from Olympus with his bow and shot into the camp, first the animals, then the men. The plague burned through the Greek force for 9 days. On the 10th, it was Achilles who called the assembly. Not Agamemnon, Achilles. He was the one who understood that the army was dying faster than the war could end, and that someone needed to ask the gods what they required. Calchas the prophet would speak only under Achilles' guarantee of protection, because what he had to say was going to anger the most powerful commander in camp. Chryseis had to be returned. The plague would not lift until she was. Agamemnon agreed and then said he would take Briseis as his replacement. Briseis had come from Lyrnessus, which Achilles had sacked. Her husband and brothers had died in the sack, killed by Achilles. She had been his captive and his prize for years. What she felt about him, the Iliad describes through implication more than statement. What Achilles felt about Agamemnon's claim on her was not ambiguous at all. It landed as an insult to his standing and an erasure of his worth in front of every man in the camp, and every man in the camp was watching. He reached for his sword. Athena appeared behind him, visible only to him, invisible to everyone else in the assembly. She grabbed his hair. She told him to sheathe the blade, to use words instead, and promised that the insult would be answered in ways a sword could not achieve. He obeyed. He put the sword away and gave Agamemnon the speech that the sword would have given, said it in front of the whole army without restraint. He called Agamemnon a coward. He called him a man who sent better fighters to die for his wars, because he lacked the courage to stand in the front rank himself. He swore by the scepter in his hand that the day would come when Agamemnon needed Achilles, and Achilles would not come. And on that day, Agamemnon would understand what he had thrown away. He threw the scepter on the ground and left the assembly. He went to the shore and sat with his mother, who rose from the sea to hold him. He told her what had happened and asked her to go to Zeus, asked that the Greeks suffer in his absence, that Agamemnon feel the weight of what he had taken. Thetis went to Zeus. Zeus nodded his agreement, the most binding gesture in the Greek cosmos, the one act the king of the gods could not take back. The scales shifted. The Trojans began to win. Hector led his forces out from the walls and drove the Greeks back in engagements that should not have been possible. The Greek wall was breached. The ships were threatened. Agamemnon watched, for weeks, what the absence of one man did to an army that had considered itself unstoppable. He sent 3 men to the beach tent where Achilles sat: Odysseus, Ajax the Greater, and Phoenix. the old man who had helped raise Achilles in Peleus's household and who had come to Troy out of loyalty to the boy he remembered rather than any obligation to the war. They came with everything Agamemnon could assemble. Briseis returned, untouched, with Agamemnon's oath that she had never been in his bed. 7 tripods of gold, 20 bronze cauldrons, 12 racehorses, 7 skilled women from Lesbos, one of Agamemnon's daughters in marriage, with 7 cities as her dowry, places with rich farmland and good harbours that would make any man wealthy for what remained of his life. All of it freely given if Achilles came back to the line. Odysseus presented the offer with every skill he had. He was the finest speaker in the Greek army, and he understood precisely how the argument needed to be shaped. He gave Achilles the version most likely to reach him. Achilles rejected it without deliberating. He said gold did not return dead men to life. He said a man had one soul and no amount of property was worth what the war was asking him to spend it on. He said his mother had described the choice. He could die young at Troy and be spoken of forever, or he could go home and live long and be known only to those who met him in person. He said he was choosing the long life. He said he would sail in the morning. Ajax spoke next, briefly and without oratory. A few direct words about the way Achilles was treating men who had come as his friends, about the strangeness of turning away everything over a single captive woman. It was the most human argument any of the 3 made, and it was the one that came closest to landing. Achilles softened for Ajax in a way he had not softened for Odysseus, acknowledged the friendship, acknowledged that the anger had not been caused by the men standing in front of him, but he could not set it down. Phoenix wept and told the old story of Meleager, a hero who had withdrawn from battle in a rage and returned only after the tide had turned against his people, too late to receive the gifts that would have been freely given earlier, forced instead to fight for nothing but necessity. The lesson was not subtle. It landed in the tent and changed nothing. Achilles heard it and still said no. The embassy left. The tent was quiet. The lyre was still in his hands. He did not sail in the morning. The morning came and passed, and he was still on the beach. He stayed there, caught between a rage he could not put down and a purpose he could not walk away from, neither going home nor crossing the distance back to the fighting, where men were dying, because he was not among them. He sat on the far edge of both things that defined him and played music into the dark, and the war continued without him, slowly and badly, with men paying in blood for a quarrel between 2 people neither of them was. The situation worsened through the weeks after the embassy. Hector pushed the Greeks back past their wall. The best commanders were out of the fighting. Diomedes with an arrow through his foot, Odysseus wounded, Agamemnon wounded. Machaon the physician struck and carried from the field. The Greek forces were holding the shore by will, rather than by any numerical or strategic advantage. The ships were in danger. From his tent on the beach, Achilles watched. He sent Patroclus to Nestor's tent one afternoon to find out who had been carried from the fighting. He had seen a wounded man brought back and could not make out who it was from the distance. He was still watching. He cared about what was happening to the Greeks in the way that a man who has decided he will not help still watches everything the people he could have helped are going through. He was absent in his body, which was the one thing that would have mattered. Patroclus came back weeping. Achilles saw him and said he looked like a small girl running to her mother, an image that in the Iliad reads not as mockery, but as tenderness. Achilles recognizing in Patroclus's distress something he recognized from long before the war, from the mountain and the years they had spent there together. He asked what was wrong. Patroclus told him what Nestor had said. Half the Greek commanders were out of the fighting. The army was bleeding on the shore, while Achilles sat on the beach with his rage, and none of what was being lost could be recovered later. He asked Achilles to either return or to let him take the Myrmidons and Achilles' own armor into the fight. He did not need to be Achilles. He needed only to look like him. The sight of that armor moving toward the Trojans might be enough to break the advance and pull the fighting away from the ships. Just that. Just enough to keep the fleet from burning. Achilles sat with this. He said he would not go himself. The insult was still what it was, and he would not fight for Agamemnon's benefit. But he agreed to Patroclus' request. He said, "Take the armor, take the Myrmidons, push the Trojans back from the ships." He gave 2 conditions, stated without ambiguity. Do not pursue them once they break. Do not push toward the walls of Troy. Push them back and return. Troy was not Patroclus's to take. It was not even yet Achilles' to take. The conditions were specific because Achilles understood something about what happened when a man who was not Achilles fought wearing Achilles' armor. That the armor made a promise the man inside it might not be able to keep. The Myrmidons had been held back for weeks from a war they had crossed the sea to fight. They armed themselves with a speed that the Iliad compares to wasps driven from a roadside nest. Not a poetic flourish, but a precise account of what happens when something that has been kept from its purpose is released. Patroclus put on the armor, greaves, breastplate, helmet, the great shield, everything except the great spear, which was too heavy for any hand but Achilles' to manage. He took Achilles' chariot and charioteer Automedon and led the Myrmidons out toward the fighting. The Trojans saw the armor and broke. They believed what the armor told them. The terrifying quality of fighting Achilles was not any single attribute, but the accumulation of them. The speed, the absolute certainty of his forward movement, the sense that nothing thrown at him had ever worked. When they saw what appeared to be Achilles crossing the ground between the ships and the trench, the belief itself did the work of an army. They fled. Patroclus fought with the skill and fury of a man who had trained alongside the greatest warrior alive for most of his life. He drove the Trojans back across the plain. He killed Sarpedon, son of Zeus, a death that Zeus watched from Olympus with genuine anguish, weighing whether to intervene against what the fates had already decided, concluding that even he could not rewrite fate without breaking something larger than the thing he meant to save. Sarpedon fell. Sleep and death carried his body home to Lycia at Zeus's instruction, while Greeks and Trojans fought over the space it left behind. Patroclus should have stopped at the trench. He had been told where to stop. He did not stop. He followed the retreating Trojans toward the walls of Troy. He attacked the walls 3 times, scrambling at the stone, and 3 times Apollo drove him back. A physical resistance, the gods' force against him, pushing him away from the city. On the 4th approach, Apollo came from behind and struck him across the back. The helmet flew from his head and rang against the ground. The spear shattered in his hand. The fastenings of his breastplate came loose. He stood in the open, without armor, without a weapon, in front of walls that had been promised to someone else, staring at a god who looked back at him without any expression that could be called pity. Euphorbus saw him standing there, a young Trojan fighter, son of Panthous, the sharpest spearman of his generation in the Trojan ranks, not Hector's equal in anything but capable and fast. He drove his spear into Patroclus from behind and pulled it out and stepped back. It was a serious wound. Patroclus staggered and turned toward the Greek lines. Hector saw him staggering and moved toward him. Patroclus had enough left to speak. He told Hector that it was not Hector who had brought him to this point. Apollo had done the real work, Euphorbus had come second, and Hector was arriving third to finish something that two others had started. Whether those words were pride or accuracy, or both, they were true to the sequence of events as they had happened. Then Hector put his spear through him. He spoke over the body afterward. He said Patroclus must have been told by Achilles to come back wearing Hector's armor, but instead, Hector had taken Achilles's. He said that even Achilles, when his time came, would not escape what was coming. He pulled the spear free, planted his foot on the body, and stripped it of the armor. Achilles' own armor, the set that Peleus had received as a wedding gift from the gods, and put it on himself. The battle over the body lasted hours. Ajax the Greater stood over Patroclus like a lion that will not leave a kill, turning away Trojan after Trojan who came for the corpse. Menelaus fought alongside him. The fighting was close and costly, and at great expense the Greeks finally carried Patroclus back toward their lines, stripped of the armor, but whole, not yet taken apart by the men who had wanted him for their own purposes. A young man named Antilochus, son of Nestor, ran to find Achilles. He found him outside his tent, watching the fighting from the beach, and he delivered the news without approaching it gradually. Patroclus was dead. Hector had the armor. The sound that Achilles made was not the sound of a man receiving news. He dropped to the ground and took the black dust of the shore in both hands and poured it over his head and down his face. He tore at his hair. He lay with his face pressed against the earth and cried out. And the cry came from somewhere that had nothing to do with the war or Agamemnon, or any of the reasons he had been sitting on the beach for weeks. The women in the tent, Briseis among them, heard the sound and came out and beat their chests and wept beside him. The cry crossed the water. Thetis heard it from the sea floor. She was sitting in the cave she kept among the Nereids when the sound reached her, and the other sea nymphs began weeping before they knew the cause, understanding from the quality of the sound what kind of loss produced it. Thetis rose from the water and came to her son, who was lying in the dirt with dust on his face and his hands still full of the shore. She sat beside him and held him and asked him what had happened. He told her Patroclus was dead. He said he wanted to die. He said the glory he had been promised had not been sufficient to keep the one person he loved most from dying, while he played an instrument 40 meters from the fighting. He said, "Let me go, kill Hector. Let me die after that. I do not want the rest of it." She told him he could not go yet. His armor was on Hector's body. He had nothing to fight in. She would go to Hephaestus that night and commission something new. She asked him to wait until morning. He agreed to wait. But he walked to the trench at the far edge of the Greek line, the ditch and stakes that separated the encampment from the open ground. And he stood there in the failing light without armor, without a spear, and called out across the plain 3 times, and Athena amplified the sound beyond what any throat could produce unaided. What reached the Trojans on the plain was not a war cry, but something that preceded war cries, the sound of Achilles alive and in grief, which turned out to be more terrifying than Achilles in armor had been. 3 Trojan warriors fell from their chariots at the sound. The Trojan lines pulled back far enough that the Greeks could drag Patroclus's body the last distance to safety. The body was there. Achilles sat beside it in the dark and held it, and his mother had gone to the forge of a god to get him something to fight with, and Hector was somewhere inside the walls of Troy, wearing the armor that Peleus had been given at the wedding on Mount Pelion, the armor that had been meant for Achilles, that had been everything his father could give him, and everything his mother had been unable to protect. He had the body. He had to wait for the morning. The night was very long. Morning came, and Thetis came with it, carrying what Hephaestus had made through the night in his forge on Olympus. She set the new armor down in front of her son, and the Myrmidons, who stood nearby, looked away from it the way people look away from things that are too bright. Achilles looked at it for a long moment. Then he picked up each piece. The shield was unlike anything that had been carried into battle before. Hephaestus had built into it a representation of everything that existed beyond the war. The entire world, depicted in concentric bands of bronze and gold and silver and tin, worked together in images that ran the full circumference of the disk. At the center, the earth, the sky, the sea, the sun and the moon, the constellations, Orion, the Pleiades, the Hyades, the Great Bear that circles the pole and never descends into the water. Then 2 cities. In the first, weddings were happening, torches and music, young men dancing in circles, women watching from doorways. In a public space, a legal dispute was being heard, 2 men arguing before judges about the blood price for a killing, the crowd calling out opinions while the elders held their staffs and listened. In the second city, an army besieged the walls while the inhabitants watched from the ramparts. Outside the walls, an ambush was being laid at a river, hidden soldiers waiting in silence for the cattle they intended to take. Beyond the cities, men ploughing a large field in long furrows, and at the end of each furrow, someone bringing them wine. A harvest in progress. Young men and women gathering grain, while a king watched from a distance, quietly pleased. A vineyard heavy with gold and black grapes on silver vines, with a path cut through it and young people carrying baskets. A herd of cattle moving toward a river, 2 lions at the front with the leading bull in their mouths, the herdsmen following and their dogs circling and refusing to get close enough to do anything useful. Then a dancing floor, the last image before the outer band. Men and women moving in a ring, and 2 tumblers spinning in the center, and singers standing apart. Then the river ocean running around the entire outer rim, and holding everything else inside it. Hephaestus had given Achilles the world to carry on his left arm, the world with its weddings and harvests and lawsuits and cattle dying in the mouths of lions. He was going to carry all of it into battle for the purpose of finding one man. He put on the greaves, the breastplate, the helmet with its gold crest. He took his father's great spear, the ashwood shaft that Chiron had cut from a mountain on Pelion, too heavy for any other man to carry. And he stepped into his chariot. One of his horses, the immortal Xanthus, spoke to him. The horse said, this day they would bring him back safely, but his death was coming, decreed by fate and a god, and there was nothing they could do to change it when it arrived. Achilles said he knew this. He had always known this. It would not stop him today. He told the horse to bring him through if it could. Then he drove toward the Trojan line. Earlier that morning, he had stood in the assembly and formally ended the quarrel with Agamemnon. The gifts were brought out. The gold, the horses, the women. Briseis returned. Achilles did not examine the gifts. He did not look at Briseis with any visible feeling. He was done with the quarrel, not because he had forgiven anything, but because he had moved out of the place in himself where the quarrel had lived. Patroclus was dead, and beside that fact, everything else now existed on a different scale entirely. His men urged him to eat before going out. He refused. He said he would not eat until he had done what needed to be done. He drove out hungry. The Trojans on the plains saw him and did not need to be told what the sight meant. Some turned and ran before he reached them. Achilles moved through the disintegrating Trojan resistance without exerting the quality of focused attention that dangerous combat requires. because nothing that came at him that day created danger. The Scamander River, which ran near the walls of Troy, filled with bodies from his killing until the river god rose against him. The current reversing, the water swelling. Achilles swept off his feet by something that was not an army. Hephaestus drove the river back with fire at Hera's instruction. The landscape of Troy itself had tried to stop him and had not managed it. Inside the walls, Priam watched from the high parapet and understood what was happening on the plain below. He called down to Hector, who stood at the Scaean gates with the city at his back. He named the sons he had already lost in these last days, and begged Hector not to make him watch another death. Hecuba stood beside her husband and bared her breast. She had nursed him, she said. If he had any love for what she had given him, he would not stand against the man crossing the plain. They were not arguing tactics. They were asking him to live. Hector stood at the gate and tried to hold his ground. He thought through what his options were. He had been outside the walls when the other Trojans ran inside, and he had let them go, had told himself he would stay. Going in now would be a particular kind of failure. He imagined approaching Achilles, unarmed, to propose terms. Helen returned, the city's wealth divided, a negotiated end to the war. He knew Achilles would kill him before the first sentence was finished. He had made his decision. He was going to stand and accept whatever came from standing. Then Achilles appeared at close range. The gap between resolving to face something and the arrival of that thing is where most such resolutions break down. Hector had made his peace with the decision when Achilles was still somewhere on the far side of the plain. When Achilles actually arrived, the new helmet, the spear, the forward movement of someone who has identified exactly the thing he is going to destroy and has no attention left for anything else. The resolution came apart. Hector turned and ran. 3 circuits of the walls of Troy, Priam and Hecuba on the parapet above. The Greek commanders held back. No one threw a spear or arrow. They might hit Achilles. Watching the 2 men run with the city, turning slowly on their right, and 2 armies watching from both directions. Zeus lifted the golden scales and placed the fates of both men in the pans. Hector's side dropped. Apollo, who had been at Hector's shoulder throughout the war, withdrew. Athena appeared beside Achilles. She took the shape of Deiphobus, Hector's brother, and appeared at Hector's side with a spear in her hand and told him, "Let's stop and face him together." Hector stopped. He turned. He saw his brother, or what looked like his brother, standing there, and he believed what he saw, because why would he question it? He called out to Achilles, "Let us agree that whoever wins will return the loser's body. Let us fight with that between us." Achilles said there were no agreements between wolves and lambs. He said nothing of that kind had ever existed between the 2 of them, and it was not going to start now. He raised the spear. Hector threw first. The spear struck the shield, and the shield held. He turned to Deiphobus for a second spear and found nothing beside him. He stood in the open and understood, in the moment of turning back and finding the space empty where his brother had been, exactly what had happened. The gods had given him up. He drew his sword and charged. Achilles knew where to put the spear. The armor Hector was wearing had been made for Achilles' own proportions. He knew where every piece of it sat, knew the exact point at the collar where it left a margin of unprotected flesh. He drove the spear through the soft part of Hector's throat, not through the windpipe, but through the flesh beside it, precisely so that Hector could fall and still speak. Hector fell. He asked Achilles to accept ransom from his family and return his body, not to leave him for the dogs. Achilles said no. He said if he could bring himself to it, he would eat Hector's flesh. There was no ransom. He had not forgiven anything, and there was nothing left in him that was going to. Hector said, "I see you clearly. I knew you would say this. Know that Paris and Apollo are going to kill you at the Scaean gates." Then he was dead. Achilles said, "Die." He said his own fate could come for him whenever it was ready. The Greek commanders gathered, and each man stabbed the body where it lay. Achilles stripped the new armor from it. He cut thongs from somewhere and pierced Hector's ankles, and threaded the leather through the holes, and tied the body to the back of his chariot, with the head loose against the ground. He drove the chariot around the walls of Troy. Priam saw and tried to climb down from the parapet to reach his son. The men around him held him back. Hecuba cried out. On the other side of the wall, in a room where she had been weaving and heard nothing yet, Andromache had sent servants to heat water for Hector's bath when he came home. She heard the sounds coming from the walls and went out to look over them. She saw the chariot. She saw what was tied behind it. She fell. When she came back to herself, her first thought was not for herself, but for her son. Astyanax would grow up without a father. He would be kept from the best seats and turned away from other men's tables, and no one powerful enough to protect his claim to a place would be alive to do it. She thought about her son's future before she thought about her own grief, which is the kind of thought that the grief of parents for their children often produces. Achilles brought the body back to the Greek encampment and left it face down in the dust beside Patroclus's burial mound. Each morning for 12 days, he rose and tied it to the chariot again, and drove 3 circuits of the mound and then left it in the dirt. Apollo kept the body. No decay came to it. No dog or bird touched it. The god who had withdrawn from Hector at the end preserved what was left of him from the treatment being given it, and the gods on Olympus watched the 12 days pass and reached a consensus that it needed to stop. On the 12th day, Zeus had seen enough. He sent word in 2 directions simultaneously. To Thetis, "Go to your son and tell him the gods are displeased, that Achilles must accept ransom and release Hector's body." To Troy, Priam was to go to the Greek camp alone, carrying gifts to ask for his son. Thetis went to Achilles and found him where he had been for 12 days, sitting beside Patroclus's burial mound, looking out at the sea. She delivered Zeus's message. He received it without argument. Something in him had been running on an intensity that 12 days had not diminished, but had hollowed out, and the instruction from Zeus may have arrived at the moment when he was ready to receive it. He said, "Let whoever brings the ransom come." He would release the body. Across the plain, in Troy, Priam prepared. He called for the finest things in his treasury, robes and cloaks and tunics and rugs, 10 talents of gold, cauldrons and tripods, and a golden cup that the Thracians had given him long ago, the most valuable objects he still possessed after 9 years of war. His surviving sons came to help him load the wagon. He looked at them and said things a father should not say to his sons, called them worthless by comparison with the ones he had lost, told them their brothers who had died were worth more than all of them together. The sons understood that grief was speaking and did not answer back. They loaded the wagon. Priam climbed up with his herald Idaeus and drove toward the gates of the city in the early dark. Hermes met him at the ford of the river as a young man, golden-skinned, moving with the ease of something that belonged to a different category of being. He told Priam who he was and where he had been sent, and he walked beside the wagon and guided it through the Greek lines in the middle of the night, while every man in the camp slept and noticed nothing. At the door of Achilles' hut, Hermes paused and told Priam he was on his own from here, and vanished. Priam went inside. Achilles was at a table with two of his companions, finishing a meal. The fire was low. Priam crossed the length of the room and went to his knees in front of the man who had killed more of his sons than anyone else alive, and he took Achilles' hands in his own. He said, "Think of your father. Peleus is old now, the same age I am, living at the edge of a world where other men may be pressing him, and he has no one beside him because his son is here, on the other side of the water. But Peleus has something that I have not. He still has the hope that his son is alive. He can think of you here at Troy, winning glory, and that thought gives him something to hold. I have nothing like that. I had 50 sons. Many of them are dead. The one I want most is lying in the dirt in front of your hut, unburied. And I have come here, to the man who killed him, to beg for him. I am doing what no man has done before. I am kissing the hands of the man who killed my sons." The room was completely quiet. Achilles wept. He wept for his father and for Patroclus, and for the grief of old men who outlived the people they made their reason for living. Priam wept beside him, on his knees on the floor of an enemy's hut, and the two of them were joined in something that had nothing to do with the war. That was in fact the oldest human feeling, the grief that loses nothing of its force when it is shared, and that needs no explanation and no justification. Then Achilles gently moved Priam's hands from his own and told him to stand. He spoke carefully. He said that grief was the portion the gods had assigned to mortals while they themselves lived without sorrow. He said Zeus had 2 jars at his threshold, one full of gifts and one full of sorrows, and he distributed from them according to what he decided. Some men received from both jars and knew the full range of human experience. Some received only from the jar of sorrows and were destroyed by what they were given. No man received only from the jar of gifts. Not even Peleus, who had received everything a mortal could receive: the finest kingdom, wealth, the respect of gods, a divine wife, had been spared the sorrow jar. He had been given one son, and that son had a short life, and would not be there to take care of him when he was old. He said, "Sit now, and let the grief settle. Weeping solves nothing. That is the condition we live inside." He went out himself and prepared Hector's body, washed it, anointed it with oil, wrapped it in clean linen and a fine robe, and lifted it onto a bier and covered it so that Priam would not have to see it and be moved to say something that might provoke the anger Achilles was holding carefully back. He brought it out and loaded it onto Priam's wagon himself. Then he went back inside and told Priam they would eat together. He told the story of Niobe, who lost all 12 of her children to divine punishment, because she had compared herself to the gods, and who eventually, even in her grief, had eaten, because the living need food, and refusing it does not honor the dead. He brought out a table and bread and meat, and they ate together in the firelight. The old king of Troy and the man who was going to die within weeks, and both of them knowing more or less what was coming, and neither of them saying it. Priam looked at Achilles across the table and was struck by what he saw. He said later, or rather Homer has him say, that he had never seen anyone so close to what a god looked like in a human form. Achilles asked how much time Priam needed for the funeral. Priam said 11 days to cut the wood and build the pyre, 1 day for the burning, 1 day for the burial mound, 12 days in total. Achilles said he would hold the Greek forces back from fighting for 12 days. Whatever Agamemnon or anyone else had to say about that arrangement, Achilles would handle it. Before dawn, Achilles woke Priam and told him to go before the camp stirred and the Greek commanders found a Trojan king inside their perimeter. He called Hermes to guide Priam back across the plain. Priam loaded his herald onto the wagon and drove in the early grey light back toward Troy, with his son on the wagon behind him. Andromache was at the gate when they arrived. She saw the wagon. She did not need to see anything else. She led the mourning, her voice first, then Hecuba's, then the voices of the women of Troy, then Helen's. Helen's lament was the one that the Iliad lingers over longest, which is a deliberate and somewhat surprising choice. Helen said that of all the men in Troy, Hector had been the kindest to her, that when the others hated her for what her presence had cost them, when they made her feel what she had brought down on the city, Hector had never spoken to her with anything but gentleness. She said she was weeping for him and also for herself, because she had no one left in Troy who would treat her that way. For 12 days the Trojans gathered the timber. For 1 day they burned the pyre. For 1 day they buried the bones and built the mound. And with the mound built and the mourning done, the Iliad's last line arrives and the poem ends. So the Trojans buried Hector, breaker of horses. The war continued. 2 more great allies came to Troy's defense in the weeks that followed. The first was Penthesilea, queen of the Amazons, a warrior who came with her women, fighters out of obligation and grief, seeking death in battle after accidentally killing her own sister in a hunting accident. She fought brilliantly for a day, and Achilles killed her. The accounts of what happened in the moment of her death, whether Achilles saw her face and felt something, whether grief for what had been destroyed entered into the killing, are among the more contested passages in the tradition. Some say he did feel something. Some say that is a later elaboration, designed to soften what was simply another combat. The Amazon tradition had its own weight and dignity before the encounter with Achilles ended it. The second ally was Memnon, king of Ethiopia and son of Eos, the goddess of the dawn who had been cursed by Aphrodite to fall in love with mortal men, and who had tried, with Tithonus, to prevent what mortality does. Memnon came with a great army and fought with the quality of a man who had some divine blood in him, which he did. He killed Antilochus, son of Nestor, who had been the one to bring Achilles the news of Patroclus' death. Achilles killed Memnon. Zeus weighed their fates in the golden scales again, as he had done with Hector, and the scales did not spare Memnon. Eos wept, and the dew that forms every morning is still, in the Greek tradition, her tears for her son. After Memnon fell, Achilles ran toward the Scaean gates. Paris was somewhere in the vicinity, on the rampart, or in the sanctuary of Apollo near the gates, or in the gateway itself, depending on which source one reads. Apollo was with him, either guiding his aim directly, or in some versions, taking Paris's shape and shooting the arrow himself. Either way, the arrow came from that direction, and it found the 1 point Thetis had been holding when she carried her infant into the underworld, the heel, the ankle, the one piece of Achilles that the water of the Styx had never touched. He did not fall immediately. He pulled the arrow out and kept fighting. He killed more Trojans in what followed, though how many and in what condition depends on the source. He fought until he couldn't. What the arrow had started finished its work somewhere between the gates and the open ground before them, and Achilles died where Hector had predicted he would die, at the Scaean gates, killed in the way Apollo had intended since the killing of Tenis on Tenedos at the beginning of the campaign. Ajax the Greater and Odysseus defended the body. Ajax held off the Trojans who came to claim it, while Odysseus lifted it and carried it through the fighting back toward the Greek lines. The same Ajax who had come to the tent on the beach to beg Achilles to return and been turned away, now fighting for the body of the man who had refused him, because what Ajax understood was that the obligation to the dead did not depend on what had happened between you when they were alive. Thetis came from the sea with the Nereids, and her grief was absolute and without restraint. The Muses came and sang his funeral dirge, which lasted 17 days. The sound of immortal voices singing for a dead man filled the Aegean coast. At the end of the morning, his ashes were gathered from the funeral pyre and mixed with Patroclus's ashes in the golden jar that Dionysus had once given to Thetis as a gift. The two of them together in the urn, as they had been together, through everything that mattered in both their lives. A great mound was raised for them on the headland at the entrance to the Hellespont, visible from far out at sea. Sailors passing through would see it for centuries and know what it was and whose names were inside it. Then the armor was offered as a prize to the best of the Greeks who remained. Ajax believed it should be his. He was the strongest fighter still standing, the one who had held the body from the Trojans, the one who had stood over Patroclus's corpse like a lion over a kill and refused to give it up. He was the best warrior. The armor of the best warrior should go to the best warrior. The argument was clear. Odysseus made a different argument, and the argument Odysseus made was better. He spoke, and Ajax stood beside him, and did not speak nearly as well. And when the judgment was given, either by the Greek commanders or by Trojan prisoners, asked to evaluate which man had done more harm to Troy, it went to Odysseus. Ajax had no frame for this. He understood strength and courage and military standing, and the clear hierarchies of physical accomplishment. He did not understand how a man who had hidden behind a shield and spoken well could walk away with what belonged to a man who had stood between the body of the greatest warrior in the world and an army that wanted it. That night, Athena sent a madness into him. He went out in the dark and attacked a herd of livestock, sheep and cattle, believing they were Agamemnon and the other commanders who had allowed the injustice of the judgment. He killed animals in the dark, thinking he was killing men. When morning came and the madness lifted, he saw the animals around him. He understood what he had done and what it meant and what he was going to have to live as having done. He found a quiet place and he fell on his own sword, which was the sword that Hector had given him as a gift after their own single combat years earlier. A duel that had ended without a decisive result and been concluded with an exchange of gifts. The sword Hector gave him was the instrument of his death. The armor Hephaestus had made for Achilles destroyed Ajax as completely as it had been unable to protect Achilles from the arrow. It simply took longer and worked through a different sequence of causes. The war went on without him. Eventually, through the wooden horse and fire and the particular ruthlessness of Neoptolemus, it ended. Neoptolemus, the son, the child Deidamia had carried and raised on Skyros, while Achilles crossed the Aegean and spent 10 years at Troy. The oracle had said the city would not fall without the bow of Heracles and without the son of Achilles. And so Odysseus went to Skyros again, as he had once gone to find the father, and brought the son back. Neoptolemus was everything the physical inheritance of Achilles could produce without the parts that Chiron had taught. He was fast and strong, and absolutely without fear, and completely without mercy. He killed Priam at the altar of Zeus during the sack of the city, a desecration so severe that it earned him the lasting enmity of the gods. He threw Hector's son, Astyanax, from the walls of Troy, the small boy who had cried at his father's helmet and made Hector laugh and take it off. The child Andromache had been mourning since the day she saw the chariot with Hector behind it. The brutality of the father, distilled and concentrated and stripped of everything that had made the father a man as well as a soldier, delivered the war's final blow. Achilles himself was somewhere else by then. In the Odyssey, Odysseus descends to the realm of the dead and performs the rituals that allow the shades to approach and speak. Among those who come to drink from the blood of the sacrifice and speak with him is Achilles. Odysseus greets him with the language of honor. "You were the most blessed of all men when you were alive," he says, "feared as a god, and here among the dead, you still have great power." He is trying to offer comfort. He is not understanding what he is being told. Achilles answers, "Do not try to make death sound like something I should be consoled by. I would rather be a hired laborer, working for a poor man with almost nothing, than be king of all the dead." This is the line, the one that the entire story of Achilles has been building toward, and that sits at the center of everything the story means. The man who chose glory over length of life, who accepted a short future at Troy over a long future at home, who drove out to fight Hector, knowing what his horse had told him that morning, that man is standing in the underworld, having achieved everything he chose, and he says he chose wrong. He says a living slave is better than a dead king. He says that what he traded his life for was not worth what he paid, or he says what he feels in the moment of saying it. The underworld is not a place where the dead have had time to reconcile themselves to anything. It is where they exist in a form that still carries the shape of the living, with the emotions of the living, without the light or the motion or the warmth that made life what it was. Whether Achilles' words in that exchange are a permanent statement of what he believes, or the grief of a shade speaking in the dark from inside the loss of everything he had, the Odyssey does not say. Homer gives the line and leaves the rest of the interpretation to whoever is reading. Other traditions are kinder. Pindar places Achilles on the Isles of the Blessed after death, the paradise reserved for the greatest heroes, the place where the finest of the dead were given everything the ordinary underworld denied. On those islands, in Pindar's account, Achilles was reunited with Patroclus, the two of them together in the paradise the gods had withheld from them in life. Some traditions add that Medea was there as well, that Achilles and the greatest sorceress of the ancient world found each other in the afterlife, and that their union produced a son named Euphorion. The Isles of the Blessed are a different answer to the same question the Odyssey poses. Which answer is true depends on which thing you need the story to be. The mound at the Hellespont stood for centuries. Sailors making the passage from the Aegean into the Black Sea would see it on the headland and know whose names were inside it. A sanctuary grew up around it, where the living came to honor the dead man and ask things of him. The Greeks understood Achilles after his death, not only as a hero, but as something close to a god, a figure with ongoing power and the capacity to affect the living world if properly approached and properly remembered. Temples and sanctuaries dedicated to him were built across the Greek world. In the Troad, near Troy, on the island of Luke in the Black Sea, where sailors reported seeing a white figure running on the shore at night. In the colonies of southern Italy, in Macedonia, along the shores of what is now southern Ukraine. He was, in the centuries after Homer, one of the most widely worshipped heroes in the Greek world. In 334 BC, a young Macedonian king preparing to invade Persia crossed from Europe into Asia and made his first stop at Troy. He went to the mound at the Hellespont. He ran around it, naked as tradition required, and anointed the stone with oil and laid flowers on it. He called Achilles the luckiest man who had ever lived because Homer had been there to give him a witness worthy of his greatness. Then he crossed into Asia and spent the next 11 years conquering most of the known world, before dying at 32 in Babylon, at almost exactly the age Achilles had been when the arrow found his heel. Alexander kept a copy of the Iliad that his teacher Aristotle had annotated under his pillow. Beside it, he kept a dagger. He slept between the story of the greatest warrior who ever lived and the means of violence, and in the morning he got up and tried to be both of them simultaneously. He failed in the way that everyone who tries to be Achilles fails, by not being able to stop. Achilles at least had a prophecy that stopped him. Alexander had nothing but his own ambition and a body that eventually gave out under the weight of what he was asking it to do. He died without seeing the end of what he had started, as Achilles had died without seeing the fall of the city he had given his life for. The story of Achilles has lasted nearly 3,000 years. It has been told in languages that did not exist when Homer first arranged it into the form we have. It has been translated, adapted, argued over, staged, filmed, illustrated, analyzed, and returned to by every generation that has had access to it. The reason is not that it answers the question it asks. It does not answer it. It asks whether the choice between a long, ordinary life and a short, glorious one is a real choice, presents a man who made it clearly and decisively, and then shows him standing in the dark saying he was wrong, and it leaves both things standing without resolving them. Achilles chose glory. He got it. He has been known for 3,000 years, which is what glory means when you receive it without reservation. And the story of his regret is itself part of the glory. The shade in the underworld saying he would rather be a poor man's laborer is one of the most famous things anyone has ever said, which means that his doubt is as immortal as his courage. The regret and the glory are inseparable. Each one makes the other possible. The man who had no doubts would not be as interesting. The man who only had doubts would not have driven out to face Hector. The tension between them is what the story is made of, and the tension is what has kept it alive. Thetis held him over fire when he was an infant and tried to give him something the world could not take back. She carried him to the underworld and dipped him in the river of the dead and held on at the heel, held on with the love that is the opposite of letting go. And through that grip came everything. The vulnerability that killed him, the humanity that made him worth mourning, the single point where the water did not reach and the world eventually entered. She was still on the island of Luke, some said, long after he was gone, waiting on the shore for the white figure that sailors reported seeing in the darkness, running as he always ran, as if speed were the answer to something, as if the fastest man who ever lived might outrun even what had been decreed for him before he was born. He never did, but he was fast, and he ran for a long time, and the story of the running is still here,